I don't think people in Britain understand how fluid the border is between the Republic and Northern Ireland. Lovely all together. You know, every year I sit backstage listening to the singers, and it really makes me realise just how talented the professionals who originally recorded these tracks were. Now, who's on next?
Siobhan McSweeney.
Hello.
Circumstances brought us together in a funny old way.
Yes.
So tell me first of all why we're in the Guildhall.
I'm actually doing a play reading as part of Frielfest, which is part of the umbrella festival of arts over borders, which incorporates 3 mini festivals. I'm part of Frielfest, which is Brian Friel, that playwright from Derry and Donegal, and we're doing a rehearsed reading of The Freedom of the City, which is a play set around the time of Bloody Sunday and in response to Bloody Sunday, about 3 people on a civil rights march through Derry who get stuck in the Guildhall and tragedy unfolds. But it's actually set in the Guildhall, so the opportunity to do this show in the actual Guildhall, I was over before the sentence was finished.
And you got in touch on Twitter and you said, well, what did you say?
I said, I was very witty, not at all snarky. I made such a good point, and there was no snark around it at all. No, I sort of made the point that even though Joe is wonderful in contacting the normal Joe, the average Joe, you would interview no women. And despite being from Cork, obviously I've got huge connections here in Derry, and I know that Derry women are not shy of an opinion or two. And I was just raising it as a snarky, like, where are all the women?
So we are trying to have a weekly stall to promote the decriminalisation of women and abortion rights and reproductive justice here in the north that we've been fighting for a very, very long time. And if we don't say loudly that this is what we want and this is what we need, that it should be a matter of healthcare and not criminal law, then we're pretty much afraid that it'll disappear and that it'll be crushed. It's not the way it needs to be.
We all know we've been lied to by politicians for a long time now on what the implications are of a hard border. I mean, for all of us who are involved here, you know, some women have different views of Brexit than others. Some would come at it from a very left point of view and would be in some ways, you know, agreeing with some form of disentangling from Europe. So the issues are not clear cut in this. Austerity, you know, Europe has had an effect on austerity across these islands, but a hard border will have serious implications because we will not know what happens with our services, and we won't know what will happen with the very few services actually that are already working cross-border.
Well, particularly, you know, vulnerable women that are, say, in the south that maybe don't have access to, you know, local access, where there's, you know, maybe the healthcare facilities that are there are very anti-choice, and they're being faced with those difficulties. For them to get any kind of assistance or for us to work together, that's going to be really, really difficult.
There's 2 faces to recent history, I think, in Derry, particularly actually female focused. One is the phenomenal cultural success of the TV show which you're a part, Derry Girls. And then there's also the tragic death of Lyra McKee earlier this year.
Yeah.
How much do you think women are moving from being victims of this conflict that happened across the border to seizing control of their own fates and really taking the reins in terms of politics here?
You know, it's interesting with the word victim as well. I think one of the reasons why women I know, they're thankfully getting fewer, but even down to the basic building block of calling yourself a feminist, and the reluctance that some women would have to call themselves a feminist has got to do not wanting to identify with the word victim, not wanting to identify with being treated any differently. The women of Ireland, and in particular the women of Northern Ireland, and especially of Derry, have always been to the forefront, however. And with regards to Derry Girls, I mean, that show is born out of lived experiences. And the show's USP is not only where it's set, but the idea that it's female-led in every sense. And that's not unusual once you're in it. It's unusual, the reaction to it.
On that point, tell me about the growing women's liberation movement here in Derry.
It's always been here. I suppose you're talking specifically with response to decriminalisation and Article 12.
I am.
Article 12 will be Amendment 12 will be the amendment that will be brought in Westminster, who are finally stepping up and doing their legal duty, which is to step in cases of human rights omissions, which is what's happening here at the moment, in that the Abortion Act of 1967, I know my date so well, hasn't been rolled out here. So as such, the women and people who can get pregnant here in the north of Ireland are under Victorian law that hasn't been changed since, this is my lovely fact, I love it so much, since the invention of the light bulb. You know, it's a real great contextual thing. You go, bonkers, mad. So in the Republic of Ireland, we had the repeal movement to repeal the 8th Amendment, which stated that the life of the unborn, of the fetus, was equal to the life of the mother, and led to dreadful, dreadful tragedies. The women and men, but it was very much a grassroots women-led movement, and it was across the island, worked together to repeal and to have an overwhelming majority vote in the referendum to repeal that 8th Amendment. Now the women and men, but again primarily led by women, movement in Northern Ireland, in Derry and Belfast, all over the province, is now focusing and gaining on that momentum from the repeal movement to ensure that the law can be changed in Northern Ireland.
The issues that are facing these border communities, they do not solely affect one gender. In fact, I would actually suggest that maybe women are even more risk about a hard border going up and their access to safeguarding, provisions of care, those sorts of things.
Completely.
Tell me more about that.
Well, I think, like any political system, if you have an imbalance, it's going to affect the oppressed a bit more, and I think women would fall under that category. So it's exactly what you said: provisions of care, things that affect women primarily, not completely, but primarily, such as childcare, such as being a single parent, such as access to schools. All these things. I don't think people in Britain understand how fluid the border is between the Republic and Northern Ireland. You have women who are working in the north and living in the south, and vice versa. And you have services that are cross-border initiatives, and they cannot be continued if you have a border. They just cannot be continued. Practically, how do you have community nurses that work across the border providing the same level of care if you have a hard border there? You have people accessing cancer treatments that are on either side of the border. You have people who, when it comes down to tax credits, and these are all things that not solely, but do affect women. And childcare, if your child has been minded in one country and working in another and lives in another, these practical, it's an absolute nightmare. And it's very easy, I think, to go, oh, we'll put up a wall. Nobody really understands the impact or even the talk.
Why do you think there is that lack of comprehension on the British side of things? Why do you think people don't understand the complexity of the border here?
I think, that's a huge question. I think a very practical reason is that you're not taught it in schools.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, you're just not taught it in schools. There is a huge gap in your knowledge. If you don't, my favourite saying at the moment, which I apply for myself, is I don't know what I don't know. And yet even what I know is still more than my peers highly educated, incredibly smart, wonderful people in London, the best people ever, and they don't understand. When I went to drama school, they didn't understand, coming from Cork, why I was using euro. They didn't understand why I needed a passport. These are fundamental things, and these aren't stupid people. So it is a lack of education. Then if you go down to why there is that lack of education, then I think you delve into a whole systemic political ideology which is still promoting this little empire kind of idea. The fact that it seems acceptable for people to say that Britain was against the slave trade. So I think it's a many-pronged, complex reason as to why people in Britain don't understand. I mean, I come from the Republic. I don't understand. But, you know, by God, the gap of information is far more serious on the side of Britain, I'm sorry to say.
It's true, there's that sense of structural amnesia almost.
That's right. Well put.
Thank you, it is my job. I studied politics all the way through school, and the first dedicated bit of teaching I really received about what happened in Northern Ireland, I did a little bit of it for my A-levels, but was when I did a module in my third year at university, and that's the first time there was like a serious dedicated study to it.
My gosh.
So
you had to wait till you were in third level education, and this was part, like, so, and what
I had to choose to do that.
And you had to choose, so it wasn't obligatory, you had to choose to do it. What year was this in? Not what year, but like, was this your first year, second year?
No, it was second year or third year.
Second year or third year. Yeah. So the filtering system, the way you have to seek out that knowledge is bonkers, because now what happens when you do not understand your own past? If you have a country that doesn't understand their own past, who are they?
Absolutely.
Who are they? And they're grabbing, and I don't mean to sort of other, but like there's this grabbing of identity, which is an identity that doesn't exist and never existed. And that's why we get these caricatures that are running riot in our political system right now. They're caricatures, they're not real people. I mean, I have a better word for them, but...
Let's say this no-deal Brexit being pursued by Boris Johnson, let's say that is the outcome that happens, and we potentially start seeing a hard border, manned installations, some kind of customs checks, whatever it is, something starts happening. What sort of impact do you think that might have on the prospects of a united Ireland?
I know, right? Oh, be careful what you wish for, isn't it? In the Republic, we're having a very interesting discussion at the moment about voting rights for Irish people who don't live in the Republic. And that is revealing a lot of quite funny ideas about that sort of link into a united Ireland. I think the idea of a united Ireland is a wonderful idea. I am not willing, and I think nobody is willing in this day and age, to have any outcome that will involve any kind of violence. Any kind of violence. Also, you have to understand that a united Ireland was an aim from a time that doesn't exist right now. The people I know in Northern Ireland, everything is always reported in a binary fashion. There are two communities. In my personal experience, and I may be wrong, I can only speak from my own experience, is that there is a third community who don't identify with either.
And I think that's growing as well.
It is growing, and they are a community that I would identify with, that a community based on diplomacy, inclusiveness, and non-violence. I think Lyra was a fine example of that. Her intellect, her youth, her passion, and her writing, that was really a voice. And the irony of her being murdered by a voice from old, that's of no use to me. That's be gone. I am not willing to have a united Ireland at any price.
There is that peaceful path to it, isn't there, in the Good Friday Agreement? There is a border poll that potentially could lead to that happening, but one imagines, regardless of how that plays out.
It's interesting that you bring up the Good Friday Agreement, but we have a situation now where heads of government departments haven't read it. It's a 34-page document. I mean, I've read it, and I'm only an actor. Do you know, like, and right now there's a court case happening with Emma D'Souza about, under the Good Friday Agreement, you can identify as British, you can identify as Irish, or you can identify as both. Under the Home Office, another wonderland of bonkerness, under the Home Office, they assume that you are British, thereby completely negating the Good Friday Agreement. So you have Westminster and government-funded institutions who have come out and said, oh yeah, even though we are under no obligation to practically implement any treaty that we have literally agreed to. I mean, what's that? Is that I don't even know what that is. I mean, I have a few words for what it is, but that makes no sense. That makes no sense. So right now, under the Good Friday Agreement, the Good Friday Agreement has been destroyed. And that's what's happening. But little bit by little bit by little bit by little bit. If they don't read it, they don't understand what it is. I've heard cases of women in Northern Ireland calling the Home Office saying about their son getting their child an Irish passport, and the information, the paid person at the Home Office telling them that they must have committed a crime and they are frauding if they have an Irish passport. If you cannot rely on the Home Office, if you cannot rely on your own government to give you the correct information, and to be told that you are a criminal and you have frauded something, this is an indication of how rotten the whole thing is. And it's quite terrifying, and I think people are very, very scared. And Brexit is a result of this fear. All the bad things are a result of the fear.
Siobhan, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you. Thanks,
Likewise.
Ollie.
Cheers.